At 11 minutes past midnight on April 1st, the first wave of Russian cruise missiles crossed into Ukrainian airspace from launch positions in the Black Sea and Caspian regions. Over the next 48 hours, Ukraine's national power grid absorbed what energy infrastructure analysts are now describing as the most sustained and technically sophisticated assault on civilian electrical systems in modern warfare. When the bombardment finally paused at 12:17 in the morning on April 3rd, more than 70% of Ukraine's baseline electrical generation capacity was offline, and the protection systems that Western defense officials had publicly characterized as comprehensive have failed to prevent what is now unfolding as a cascading infrastructure collapse with consequences extending far beyond Ukraine's borders. Subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications before going any further. What happened to Ukraine's power infrastructure over these 48 hours is not simply another chapter in an ongoing conflict. It is a systematic demonstration of offensive capability against hardened targets that defense planners across NATO member states are studying with urgent attention, because the protective architecture that failed in Kiev this week is fundamentally similar to what protects critical infrastructure in Warsaw, Berlin, and London. The pace at which the operational picture is diverging from official communications means you cannot afford to be behind this analysis when the next development breaks. To understand the full weight of what occurred, it is necessary to first understand what Ukraine's electrical grid actually represents to the country's survival as a functioning state, because this was not an attack on military targets. It was an attack on the basic systems that allow modern society to operate. Ukraine's power grid supplies electricity to 41 million people across an area larger than France. It processes the energy requirements for industrial manufacturing, agricultural production, water treatment facilities, hospital operations, telecommunications networks, banking systems, and food refrigeration chains, heat for residential buildings during sub-freezing temperatures, fuel for transportation infrastructure, and power for military command and control systems, all run through this single integrated network. Ukraine has no equivalent alternative. The country cannot import sufficient electricity from neighboring European grids to compensate for domestic generation losses at the scale now documented. For baseline societal function, the national power system is the only option that exists. That infrastructural reality is the strategic context without which the attack cannot be properly understood. Russia did not damage one of several backup systems. It targeted the single point of failure supporting Ukrainian state continuity. The technical execution of the bombardment reveals planning sophistication that challenges previous assessments of Russian precision strike capabilities, according to data compiled by Ukrainian Energy Ministry officials and verified by independent monitoring from the Institute for the Study of War. The assault employed a minimum of 470 individual munitions across 6 distinct weapon systems over the 48-hour period. The first wave utilized Kalibr cruise missiles launched from naval platforms in the Black Sea, approaching Ukrainian airspace from the southwest at subsonic speeds below radar detection thresholds. These were followed 18 minutes later by Kor 101 air-launched cruise missiles deployed from Tu-95 strategic bombers operating over Russian territory, creating multiple simultaneous approach vectors that divided Ukrainian air defense responses. The third wave introduced Shahed 136 loitering munitions, Iranian-designed drones that Ukraine's air defense networks have engaged repeatedly throughout this conflict. But the sequence in which these systems were deployed reveals strategic purpose beyond simple munition expenditure. The Shahed drones were not intended to destroy hardened transformer stations. They were designed to force Ukrainian air defense batteries to reveal firing positions and deplete interceptor inventories before the primary strike packages arrived. By hour 6 of the bombardment, Ukrainian S-300 and Buk-Mu-1 air defense systems protecting critical energy facilities had exhausted between 60 and 70% of available interceptors engaging low-value drone targets. When the next wave of Kalibr and Kar 101 missiles approached 40 minutes later, The defensive umbrella that had been positioned to protect power generation stations was operating at significantly reduced capacity. The munitions that penetrated Ukrainian air defenses during hours 12 through 36 of the assault were not randomly distributed across the electrical grid. They were concentrated on specific transformer substations that function as critical nodes in Ukraine's power distribution architecture. The Dniprovska substation northeast of Zaporizhzhia sustained 7 direct impacts from precision-guided munitions during a 14-minute engagement window. That facility routes electrical transmission from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power complex, Europe's largest nuclear facility, into Ukraine's national grid. The substation's destruction does not eliminate the nuclear plant's generation capacity, but it severs the connection through which that electricity can reach population centers. The reactors continue operating, but the power they generate cannot be distributed. Similar targeting was documented at the Vinnytsia thermal power station, the Kremenchuk substation complex, and the Kharkivska transmission hub. Each facility represents a choke point where electricity generated at multiple power plants converges before distribution to regional grids. Destroying these nodes creates disproportionate impact compared to targeting individual generation facilities because a single substation handles transmission from multiple power sources simultaneously. The Russian targeting strategy exploited network architecture vulnerabilities that defensive planning had not adequately protected. Now to the question that defense analysts across European capitals are examining with increasing urgency. Why did Ukraine's Western-supplied air defense systems fail to prevent this level of infrastructure damage? Ukraine's power generation facilities were protected by a layered defensive architecture consisting of Soviet-era S-300 batteries, recently delivered NASAMS surface-to-air missile systems from the United States, Iris-T air defense platforms from Germany, and Crotali short-range systems from France. These systems were fully operational. They detected the incoming cruise missiles and drones. Ukrainian air defense units fired an estimated 620 interceptors during the 48-hour bombardment. The interception rate across all engagement attempts was approximately 42%. That failure was not random, and it was not the result of operator error or equipment malfunction. It was the mathematical outcome of an offensive strategy specifically designed to overwhelm defensive capacity through volume, sequencing, and technical capability that current interception systems cannot reliably counter. The Kh-101 cruise missiles that struck Ukrainian substations during the bombardment's second day incorporate maneuvering flight paths during terminal approach that complicate interception geometry. Unlike ballistic missiles that follow predictable trajectories, these cruise missiles execute random directional changes in the final 30 seconds before impact, forcing interceptors to continuously recalculate engagement solutions. When defensive systems are already operating at reduced interceptive availability after engaging drone waves, the probability of successful interception against maneuvering targets drops substantially. The Shahed 136 drones introduced additional complications that Ukrainian air defense operators described in post-engagement debriefings. These systems cost approximately $20,000 per unit to manufacture, compared to surface-to-air interceptors that range from $100,000 to $600,000 depending on the system. The cost mathematics create an attrition dynamic that favors the attacker. Russia can deploy 10 Shahed drones for the cost of a single interceptor missile, forcing Ukraine to make impossible calculations about which incoming threats justify interceptor expenditure and which must be engaged with less reliable alternatives like anti-aircraft artillery. If the channel is providing the analysis this situation deserves, the kind that explains mechanisms rather than just reporting events, subscribe now and share this video with anyone trying to understand what is actually happening behind the daily headline cycle. When the next wave launches, when the next satellite imagery analysis confirms what official briefings have not addressed, the analysis will be here. The economic consequences of what happened to Ukraine's power grid have now reached a scale that extends far beyond the conflict zone and into the daily economic reality of people in countries with no direct involvement in this war. Understanding the specific mechanisms by which this infrastructure collapse is generating those consequences is essential to understanding why they will not resolve quickly, even if military operations stop tomorrow. Ukraine's industrial electricity consumption has dropped from a pre-bombardment baseline of 18 gigawatts to approximately 6 gigawatts as of April 4th. That reduction is not a temporary disruption. It is the cumulative result of sustained targeting of transformer substations and generation facilities that cannot be repaired through emergency maintenance. Restoring full grid capacity requires replacement of heavy electrical equipment that is manufactured by specialized facilities with production timelines measured in months, not weeks. The transformers that were destroyed at the Dniprovska substation weigh between 80 and 120 tons each. They cannot be transported by standard freight rail. They require custom fabrication at plants in Germany, Sweden, or South Korea, followed by specialized shipping and installation procedures that take a minimum of 4 to 6 months under peacetime conditions. The weekly economic cost of operating Ukraine's economy at 35% of normal electrical capacity is approximately $4 billion. That figure includes direct losses from halted industrial production, estimated at $1.8 billion per week, agricultural disruption from non-functional irrigation systems and refrigeration chains, adding $600 million per week, and forced business closures in the service sector, contributing $1.6 billion in weekly losses. These are not speculative projections. They are calculations based on documented production shutdowns across Ukraine's steel manufacturing sector, grain processing facilities, and commercial operations that cannot function without reliable electricity. The European Union's exposure to these economic disruptions extends through multiple channels that policy discussions have not adequately addressed. Ukraine supplies approximately 15% of global grain exports during normal harvest years. The country's grain storage facilities and processing plants require consistent electricity to maintain refrigeration systems preventing spoilage and to operate the conveyors and elevators that move grain from storage to transport infrastructure. Without reliable power, grain that was successfully harvested sits in storage facilities where it degrades at a rate of approximately 2% per week during spring temperatures. By week 8 of sustained power disruption, total grain losses could reach 4 to 5 million tons, equivalent to the annual wheat consumption of Egypt and Pakistan combined. The cascading effect reaches European food markets through price mechanisms that the average consumer will experience directly at grocery stores over the next 60 to 90 days. Wheat futures contracts on European commodity exchanges have increased by 18% since April 1st, reflecting trader expectations that Ukrainian export capacity will remain suppressed through the remainder of the planting and harvest season. That 18% increase in wholesale wheat prices translates to consumer bread prices rising by approximately 12 to 14% by mid-June, affecting household grocery budgets across the European Union's 450 million residents. The insurance mathematics of infrastructure targeting create additional economic pressure that extends beyond immediate repair costs. Actuarial models used by European energy infrastructure insurers to calculate premiums now incorporate the demonstrated vulnerability of hardened substations and generation facilities to sustained precision missile bombardment. Insurance rates for critical infrastructure in Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states have increased by factors ranging from 40 to 70% since January, as underwriters price in the risk that defensive systems systems cannot reliably protect against the offensive capabilities Russia demonstrated in Ukraine. Those insurance cost increases flow through to electricity transmission rates charged to industrial and residential customers, creating permanent cost escalation that will not reverse even if active hostilities end. The broader strategic question that emerges from assembling all of these elements is the one that defense planners across the NATO alliance are beginning to ask with increasing urgency. Can the current architecture of air defense systems deployed across European member states reliably protect critical infrastructure against the offensive capabilities that Russia has now demonstrated it can sustain for extended periods? Both Ukrainian officials and Western defense ministers are projecting confidence that protective measures remain adequate. The battlefield reality documented over these 48 hours suggests something considerably more complicated. The most intensive bombardment of civilian infrastructure in modern European warfare arrived just weeks after senior Pentagon officials were publicly stating that Russian precision munition stockpiles had been degraded to levels insufficient for sustained operations. That contradiction between official assessment and documented capability may be the most revealing data point of the entire conflict. Either the intelligence evaluations of Russian munition production were fundamentally wrong, or Russia maintained operational reserves substantially larger than NATO intelligence estimated, or manufacturing capacity was reconstituted faster than Western sanctions were projected to prevent. Each of these explanations carries different implications for European security planning. If intelligence assessments underestimated Russian stockpiles, then current defensive preparations are calibrated against threat projections that do not match operational reality. If sanctions fail to constrain munition production at projected levels, then the economic pressure strategy requires fundamental reassessment. If Russia can sustain precision missile expenditure at rates of 200 munitions per day for extended periods, then the defensive architecture protecting critical infrastructure in Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania cannot be assumed adequate based on the attrition models that guided deployment planning. The targeting pattern documented across 48 hours reveals strategic preference for infrastructure nodes rather than distributed targets. Russia did not attempt to destroy every power plant in Ukraine. It concentrated strikes on the small number of transformer substations that function as critical distribution hubs, maximizing impact through minimal munition expenditure. That same targeting logic applies to critical infrastructure in every NATO member state. Warsaw's electrical grid depends on 7 major substations. Bucharest's power distribution runs through 9 critical nodes. Vilnius operates on 4 primary transformer complexes. The defensive requirements for protecting 9 critical substations differ dramatically from the requirements for defending distributed infrastructure across an entire country. But the current air defense deployments in eastern NATO states are not concentrated around those critical nodes. They are distributed to provide area coverage that may not adequately protect the specific facilities whose destruction would create cascading system failure. The window during which European infrastructure remains vulnerable to the demonstrated Russian offensive capability extends until one of 3 conditions changes. Either air defense interception rates improve substantially against maneuvering cruise missiles and saturation drone attacks, or critical infrastructure nodes are hardened to withstand direct precision munition impacts, or deterrence frameworks convince Russian military planners that infrastructure targeting carries costs exceeding benefits. Current evidence does not suggest any of these conditions are approaching resolution. Air defense technology improvements that would raise interception rates against maneuvering cruise missiles to levels adequate for reliable infrastructure protection require either next-generation interceptor systems not yet in production or fundamental changes to engagement doctrine that increase intercept expenditure per incoming threat. Neither solution resolves within timelines measured in months. Infrastructure hardening sufficient to protect transformer substations weighing 100 tons against 700-kilogram warheads, requires either underground relocation of critical equipment or reinforced protective structures with construction timelines extending across multiple years. Deterrence frameworks depend on threat credibility that current European military posture has not established, given the constraints on escalation that Ukraine's experience has revealed. Here is where the complete picture stands on day 2 following the conclusion of Russia's 48-hour bombardment campaign. Ukraine's electrical generation capacity operates at approximately 30% of baseline levels. 73 major transformer substations and power generation facilities sustained damage requiring 4 to 6 months minimum for replacement equipment fabrication and installation. Industrial production has collapsed to levels that will generate $4 billion in weekly economic losses for duration of grid disruption. European grain supplies face shortages that will manifest in 12 to 14% bread price increases by mid-year, and the offensive capability that produced these results remains intact and has demonstrated sustainability that contradicts previous intelligence assessments of Russian munition stockpiles and production capacity. Russia achieved all of this without deploying hypersonic missiles, without nuclear escalation, and without ground force advances beyond current frontline positions. This is the strategic logic that the infrastructure targeting campaign was designed to execute. Demonstrate that critical systems supporting modern society cannot be adequately protected with current defensive architecture. Create economic disruption that extends beyond conflict zones into populations of countries not directly involved in hostilities, and establish that the costs of continued resistance extend beyond battlefield casualties into the basic systems that populations depend on for daily survival. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. When the damage assessments from Ukrainian energy officials reach the scale that official framing can no longer minimize, when the European grain shortage produces the grocery price increases that mathematical models project, when the next targeting campaign demonstrates whether this capability can be sustained or was a one-time stockpile expenditure, the analysis will be here. This channel documents the gap between official characterization and operational reality. Evidence first. What it means for you always. Leave one question in the comments before you go. Can current air defense technology keep pace with what is being demonstrated in this conflict, or are we watching the architecture of infrastructure protection being tested in ways it was not designed to survive? Every response gets read and considered. This is the analysis that connects battlefield developments to the consequences that will reach your household budget, your energy costs, and the strategic stability of the continent. The evidence is documented, the implications are unavoidable, and the next development is already forming.